Okay, great. Well, thank you all for coming, and thank you, Kati and Andy, for setting us up, and Philip for being here. I am so excited to present to you guys Autopoietic Bloom, a project of mine that's been about a year in the making. This is a mood-based improvisation engine for sentient architecture systems. So let me give you a quick rundown of what it really is. It's essentially a suite of 24 improvisational schemes and custom software that I wrote for the real-time interpretation and performance of these schemes by compatible living architecture. In this case, it's Amatria. With Autopoietic Bloom, Amatria can compose and improvise and perform a musical work that is unique every single time. Each improvisation is a non-repeatable event, an expression of uniqueness of identity, and an opportunity for human connection. And the uniqueness of that aesthetic experience will sort of bind people in this really implicit way, which I think is really beautiful. So I want to give you a quick rundown of sort of the conceptual side of this piece, and then we'll talk a little bit about the technical stuff. So I was very much concerned with making something that was integrated with the same sort of ideas that were present already in the sculpture, as opposed to something that was sort of unrelated, that simply used 10 speakers. So I used as my point of departure many of the same questions that LASG has been investigating since their inception, such as, can architecture integrate living functions? Can future buildings think or care? And how do humans respond to these evolving interactions in a process of mutual adaptation? Well, I sort of took this in my own direction and began asking things like, can living architecture help people to create social or parasocial relationships with their environments? Can living architecture mediate social relationships among people? And then what role does sound play in that mediation? And how can people connect with each other through a shared sonic environment? So thinking about that, I began to develop some desiderata for this project. And since my goals were very artistic, all of the things that I was trying to accomplish were phenomenological in nature. In other words, they were all about the experience of listening and being present in this space, as opposed to, say, ontological ideas about, whether a machine can improvise music. That's very interesting, but really what I'm after is the impact, the emotional impact of everything. So the first thing was I wanted to create a musical experience that allows people to deepen their relationship with the architecture of Luddy Hall and with each other as mediated through Amatria. I wanted to create a musical experience that deepens the sense that Amatria is alive. I wanted to situate the observer in the sculpture in the same quote unquote sacred time and space. That number 3, I might gloss over a little bit just for the sake of time, but the idea is that when you're in the aesthetic experience, you feel like you're in the same world that you're walking into. I wanted something that had a life beyond a single performance. And then finally, I wanted something that was distinct enough from Amatria's normal sound design, where it wasn't sort of superseding it or subverting it in any way, but just something that would sort of complement its normal sound design. So time and space is a mediator of human relationships. Does anyone recognize this photo? Has anyone been here before? This is a place called The Slope at Cornell University. It was around 2016 or 2015 when I was walking along a sidewalk here and the sun was setting behind the hill. I didn't take this photo, but it was a similar thing to this photo. And I remember just sort of standing there and deciding I was just gonna watch the sunset for a while. And after a few minutes, I looked around and I noticed maybe half a dozen people had stopped walking and they were standing there as well. And when the sun set, we all went our separate ways. We didn't say anything to each other. We didn't know each other's names, but it was this really beautiful experience that connected us all in a very implicit way that I thought was very beautiful. So that's sort of the ethos that I was operating under when I tried to kind of address the first of those 5 desiderata there. Next, I want to talk a little bit about biomimesis through music. I was very much inspired by Amatria's behavior engine, which is the software that controls all of her lights and servos. Basically, the idea is that you can't really explicitly control individual lights and everything, but you can kind of parametrically define how the sculpture behaves. And so that idea of parametric, of defining things parametrically and then letting the sculpture kind of have these sort of emergent behaviors within those boundaries was something that I found very inspiring. I also wanted this to sort of personify Amatria. Oh, there he is. And give her the ability to have some agency in the music. So she decides what to sing and when to sing, as opposed to us kind of pushing a button and then having her sing. Of course, today we will be pushing a button, but generally speaking, we won't be. I wanted to center the musician, that is to say Amatria, as the composer. And especially, this was really important because for me, the sort of central idea that I ended up with was that the ability to create art implies life. The ability to create something or to make something creative helps to give the impression of life. And so that's where we get to the idea of autopoiesis. Many of you may have heard this term before. It's used a lot in cognitive science and in complex systems theory. But the idea is it comes from the Greek word auto, meaning self, and poiesis, creation. And it's essentially a way of defining a living system by talking about the way that it can reproduce and maintain itself by using its own components to create more of its own components. And so the metaphor here is that as Amatria gives life to music, the music then in turn creates an impression of life for Amatria. So there's that reflexive quality here. Finally, it's just some distinctions from the original sound design, which I think are important to point out. First one is that mainly what affects when she decides to sing and what she sings, it's affected by kind of a subjective variable called mood, which is essentially mainly tied to local weather data. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second, as opposed to the acute sense data that you might get by looking at its sensors and stuff. The singing kind of occurs less frequently as normal sound design. And then the sounds are organized differently. There's a beginning and middle and end for the various pieces, as opposed to being something that can kind of exist without a beginning, middle, or end. And then finally, on a conceptual level, I sort of think about Autopoietic bloom as Amatria singing, whereas her normal sounds are sort of her speaking. So her identity is sort of characterized by her normal sounds in the same way that our idiolects kind of are characterizations of our normal sounds. Whereas when you sing a song, you kind of put on a persona, you kind of put on a costume. And that's kind of the idea. It's a thing you are versus a thing you do. And I'm going to skip this last one for the sake of time. So now we can dive into sort of how it works, some sort of high level ideas about how it works. So two things that I really wanted to be sure that I was doing was, number one, I wanted to be able to think like a musician, and number two, I wanted it to be able to be flexible and extensible in case it ever wants to be integrated to any other system that Amatria has. I was really concerned with defining parameters, which then define the bounds for an improvisatory kind of practice that the machine can do on its own. So I decided to work with weather data as kind of the main mediator of those parameters. The reason that I used weather data is because I think that weather actually, even though we might not think about it this way, it actually profoundly affects people's mood all the time. And so this is kind of a way for Amatria to respond empathically to the community in Luddy Hall without having to sort of surveil you or get your biometric data in any weird way. So all the improvisations are predefined parametrically at a musically high level, which is sort of inspired by Amatria's behavior engine. And then she synthesizes those parameters to compose or improvise a unique piece of musical artistry. So these parameters can be defined by anyone, but only Amatria can really choose the individual notes and rhythms and transformations. So let's talk a little bit about the different software components. I'll point out a few salient features here. The first one I think is important is this weekly wake-sleep scheduler. This basically helps Amatria to decide, she can decide when to sing, but maybe you don't want her to sing when there's classes going on or something like that. So you can say, okay, from this time to this time on this day, be quiet. Or you can say on weekends, you can sing as loud as you want or whatever. And then the next thing that I'm going to talk about is this improvisation engine over here. I'll also just point out for those at home, Philip et al., the ambisonic spatializers, which are going to be used to listen to this music. It's essentially a way that Autopoietic bloom can kind of simulate the acoustics of Luddy Hall and the specific locations of all the speakers and kind of mix it down for you in this virtual environment. So it'll be a little bit different than what we hear in person, but it's the same idea. So this whole thing was built and coded in Max using a couple of wonderful libraries that I'll talk a little bit about in a moment. This is a kind of schematic of the information flow. The most important modules are the ones sort of right here: Zoe, Donatoni, Syrinx, and Quincy. So these four form the real core of the improvisation engine. The idea being that Donatoni is the gesture generator. It's what creates all the raw note data. There's no sound yet, it's just data. That gets sent over to Syrinx, which turns that into sound. Then that gets sent through Quincy, which distributes those 4 voices out to the 10 speakers in different ways. And then finally, to kind of tie everything together, we have the breakpoint interpolator. So here is again the sort of 4-part structure of the modular improvisation engine. We'll talk first about the gesture note generator. This makes use of the Bach library for Max, which is just an incredible way of thinking about notes. It was written by Andrea Agostini and Daniele Ghisi, who are 2 incredible musicians and computer scientists. The real crown jewel is that you can represent musical data as list-like linked lists, which are essentially just nested arrays. And a nested array is a wonderful way of representing musical information, because the way that we think about music is so hierarchical. You have measures, and then you have chords, you have notes. And so all these things can be represented through a nested array. And so what Donatoni does is it sort of manipulates these lists in real time and sends 4-voice MIDI data out to the synthesizers. It's just 4 voices. It could theoretically support up to 16, but we don't really need 16. There are only 10 speakers, and 4 worked for the Beatles, so it's good enough for me. Then Syrinx is the multi-channel synthesizer. We have 4 parametrically controlled synths, 1 for each Donatoni voice. Each voice supports up to 4 simultaneous control signals, so you can sort of shape sounds dynamically. You can add filter sweeps and things like that if you want to. And the real core of this is a synthesizer called Absinthe 5 by Native Instruments, it just makes things extremely flexible. Basically, instead of having to predefine every single parameter for every time you change instruments, you can essentially create the instrument in advance and then just load a preset, which makes it extremely easy in terms of information flow. Then we have Quincy, which is the dynamic mixer. Quincy distributes the signal from Syrinx to the 10 channels, and it does it in a way that can change over the course of the song. So one of the things you'll hear is certain sounds changing where they come from. And so that was also an important part that I wanted to include. And it uses similar algorithms as the Donatoni module to manipulate speaker configurations as nested arrays and then decode them in real time. So when we think about this, we have Quincy, Syrinx, and Donatoni, which essentially is a sophisticated programmable wind chime. There isn't really anything compositional about it yet. And so to really turn wind chimes into a musical experience, to turn soundscape into narrative, to turn speaking into singing, recitative into aria, it needs something that can create a sense of transformation, a sense of musical intention. And so the solution to this is the Zoe module, which is essentially an interpolation engine, which allows you to essentially define what you want to have happen at the beginning of the song, what you want to have happen at the middle, and what you want to have happen at the end. And then Amatria can kind of seamlessly interpolate between all of those things and create a sense of drama, a sense of direction, a sense of transformation, a sense of autopoiesis. So all the parameters, there are 235 parameters at a time per breakpoint, can be interpolated over the length of the composition. So you can create music that has climaxes and nadirs and beginnings and middles and ends and crescendi, etc. And so the possible points that you can interpolate through are virtually endless, and it also can scale very easily. So if you have, say, a 3-minute song that you realize it actually should be a 10-minute song, you can change it to 10 minutes and it'll kind of stretch along with you. So that's basically a rundown. So some concluding remarks here before I give you the demonstrations. Just another thank you to everyone here, especially Philip and Matt and Rob, Orbey and Michael for helping with sort of teaching me how the thing works, how the sculpture works. Big thank you to Kati and Anandi and Medina for putting this together. And a couple of extra thank yous for the folks who either helped me with some advice on the technical side of things or who simply just wrote some incredible software. Just some preparation for what you're going to hear. This is going to be the song that kind of corresponds with the rainfall weather pattern. So this form is, the form of this, I chose it specifically because it really showcases the improvisational process. The second voice that you're going to hear, which is going to sound sort of like a kalimba, it's like this percussive kind of instrument. very kind of playful sound. That voice, you'll note how it transforms over time, even though there's improvisation happening in all the voices, but the second voice especially shows a lot of transformation. And at home, if you're watching from home, you'll sort of hear this as an ambisonic experience. You'll also get the benefit of having a nice visualizer, so you can see what voice is coming out of what speaker. So with that, I will take this off, and we can begin here.
Thank you so very much, Maggie. That was beautiful. So on that note, I see that we have Philip with us now. So Philip, I suggest that we go over to you now. Let me just give me a second to turn my speakers on.
Hello there, colleagues. I hope that you can hear me. Miggy, what an absolutely exquisite and beautiful birthday greeting for Amatria. It's hard to put into words just what respect and pleasure and sheer beauty that offered. I feel very, very grateful to you and really to everyone within the Amatria community.